Newspapers today are one of the biggest forms of communication. Whether it's from the New York Times and USA Today, these are two of the main sources of communication in which people find out about their news and things going on today. But have you ever tried reading an African American newspaper and noticed the differences? The history of African American newspapers includes a rocky road of racism, challenges, and accomplishments within the Black Lives community. Critics will see, one, the information provided in a white-owned newspaper versus a black-owned newspaper, and will feel like they're not getting all of the information they need. African American newspapers focus more on each person's individual story and connect more with the reader, whereas white newspapers focus more on the bigger picture. Two, they have poems written by African American artists and ads for black-owned businesses within the newspapers. The papers speak of tragedy, but do not put the people dealing with it on blast and exploit them. Every death is treated as a loss and published in the paper along with birthdays and special occasions. So more people are being recognized within the community. The idea is also to stay as connected as a community, because everything that we are reading within the newspaper ultimately at the end of the day promotes, advertises, and speaks to Black people. The best way to find out more about this topic for me was to use references, journals, and search up websites on people who actually had either been around with African American newspapers were starting to get more popular, or who had seen for themselves the racism in white newspapers versus Black. Furthermore, with the upbringing of the first ever African American newspaper, Freedom's Journal, founded by Rev. John Wilk, racism grew along with it. White folk at the time developed jealousy over the fact that people of color now had something that they couldn't take from us. They thought, oh, well, now they're allowed to have their own thing? Why should they be able to do that like we've been able to do all this time? I also read in an article by Philip Luke, senator, in which he says how these white newspapers reported on race and how they signaled Blackness as threatening. This contributed to not just perceptions about Black people, but stirred responses that imperiled the lives of African Americans and put them in danger. Secondly, the Caucasians published newspapers only allowed segments on Black people who have committed a crime or have been caught for doing drugs. On the contrary, Black-owned newspapers underwent challenges on their way to success and failure. African Americans, at the end of the day, had to be careful with what they said. They used their platforms because they did not have anywhere near as much privilege as white newspapers. A line from one of the writers on an African American newspaper site makes a great connection to this, stating, "What a white man can get away with, a Black man would get lynched for," which this ultimately is a statement that we should all keep in mind, because what a white person does will never be the same for what a Black man does. So creating a newspaper that is fully about a Black person and about their experience in this society is something that is going to make white people so angry. However, this was still something that African Americans needed to do to show that they could finally have something of their own and they couldn't take this from us. Although the part that turns out to be the most intriguing about African American newspapers is the fact that they are written for everyone. In an African American inspired research paper named The Voice of Freedom, they spoke on this, saying their vast landscape offered something that the big white newspapers left out: pictures and stories about Black doctors, lawyers, politicians, etc. And because of this, because people in Black newspapers were beginning to put these people in there, people like doctors and Black lawyers were getting recognized for their efforts when they never were. As a result, Black children who are also reading these newspapers did not allow themselves to get the kind of trouble that they could have gotten into if they had not seen all the Black leaders that have become successful, especially that were represented in those newspapers. But in conclusion, the history of African American newspapers has proved to be the center of racism, challenges, and accomplishments for people within the African American community. Without them, people today would be unaware of the hardships or exciting moments people of color have experienced over the years leading up to today. This newspaper should be something that should never continue again.